Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence to the Economics Legislation Committee on the Treasury Laws Amendment Electric Car Discount Bill 2022. The bill provides modest and beneficial changes to the tax treatment of electric vehicles. It is a welcome first step following a decade of inaction on zero emissions transport. The proposed amendments to exempt electric vehicles from the fringe benefits tax will provide an incentive for employers to assist employees to purchase electric vehicles and help create a much-needed market for second-hand electric vehicles. The bill is applicable to battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, collectively termed zero or low emissions vehicles. The Australia Institute recommends narrowing the wording to include only zero emissions vehicles. This would bring federal transport legislation in line with leading policy in the ACT, Europe and other markets. Changes brought about by the bill form a piece of the puzzle to make the transition away from internal combustion vehicles across Australia. Additional policies to encourage both supply and demand of electric vehicles will complement this move and accelerate the decarbonisation of Australia's transport. Last Friday, at the National EV Summit co-hosted by the Australia Institute, the Electric Vehicle Council, the Smart Energy Council and Boundless, the philanthropic fund of Mike Cannon-Brookes, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy announced the National Electric Vehicle Strategy. As part of the strategy, the Minister announced that the federal government will be investigating the inclusion of mandatory fuel efficiency standards, standards with ambition that are, quote, as close to best practice as is achievable. The implementation of such standards would finally put Australia in line with almost all other countries in the OECD. The National EV Strategy offers the opportunity for a coordinated approach to achieve zero emissions transport in Australia, working with state and territory governments to encourage individuals to buy electric vehicles. The benefits of being behind the pack means that we can learn from others' successes, for example, on registration rebates and priority lane access for zero emissions vehicles. There are also more policy opportunities, like trade-in rebates and exempting electric vehicles from the luxury car tax. The Australia Institute's polling shows that Australians strongly support policy incentives that make electric vehicles more affordable and accessible. There is a clear appetite for Australia to take more decisive steps to make the transition to zero-emission transport, which will in turn reduce our reliance on imported oil. Alongside the National EV Strategy, we need a complementary liquid fuel security strategy, given that 91% of our fuels are derived from imports. We need to have demand-side solutions to lower demand for foreign oil. These additional policies would complement the changes that will be brought about by the Electric Car Discount Bill to bring about a much-needed push towards transport decarbonisation, which my colleague Richie Merzian will speak more about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Merzian.
That concludes our opening statement. Senator, it might be more practical for us to open up to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you both. I'll just kick off with a quick general question. In your submission and in your opening statements, you've called the bill a modest contribution to correct a decade of inaction. And you've said you'd like some changes to this bill, and also that you think there's just a lot more that needs to be done over time. Just to start off with, can you just expand on your comments that the FBT exemption will have some impact on employer behaviour in providing EV vehicles and flow into the second-hand market? So, albeit that you'd like to see more changes, can you just tell us how you think this particular change will help stimulate the EV market?
Be happy to, Chair. It's our understanding that about 50% of new car sales are fleet purchases in Australia, and therefore finding ways to incentivise fleet purchase of zero-emission vehicles is a key part of how we decarbonise transport. Transport is a bit under 1/5 of our national emissions, but more concerningly, of all the different sectors in the economy, transport has grown the most since we originally signed up to the UN Convention on Climate Change. So any policy that can bring down transport emissions is a welcome one, and this is certainly part of that picture. Targeting fleet purchases, incentivising businesses to allow employees to purchase electric vehicles, and then obviously excluding from the FBT, I think will be a key part in driving that, because we know that first-hand purchases often do come from fleets, and we know that oftentimes they'll rotate relatively quicker than if it was solely for private use. Then we will see more vehicles ultimately flow into the second-hand market. Currently, there are few cars in the second-hand market in the electric vehicle space. The shortage in Australia is not just in the first-hand market, but also in the second-hand market. I know just from personal experience that there's now far more interest in importing second-hand electric vehicles in Australia because there is a real shortage in terms of those more affordable rates, and second-hand cars will provide more affordability in the electric vehicle space as well. So it is a useful, welcome change. Our comment around the modesty of this approach is that it is one of many policies that the government can bring forward and the Parliament can approve, and would be happy to talk to some of the others as well, including our suggestion for amending the legislation as well.
Okay. Just one more question from me before I share the call with colleagues. Because you do have some ideas about amendments to the bill, and because you've got quite a wide suite of additional sort of measures that you'd like to see in place, what are your views about the 3-year review that is part of the legislation? Do you think that's an opportunity to have a look at how we've gone and potentially expand further?
In response to your question, Chair, yes, it would be a good opportunity to check in to see how the changes have come about. I know that some other submissions shared concerns around whether that will send the right signals in terms of the confidence for people to invest in these cars. Currently, there's a shortage in the supply of electric vehicles, first-hand electric vehicles, and this is also backdated. And so I think there are reasonable points to be made about whether that should be extended out, not just 3 years, maybe a bit later, and then also just clarifying the fact that that the review won't take place any earlier, that anything will be, in a sense, honoured that has been purchased within that period. So I think further clarity around that and potentially extending it might be worth doing given the current state of the market.
Okay. Thank you both very much. I'm sure there's lots of questions for you, so I'll go first to Senator Rice.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you both for your submission and for your contributions this morning. You talked about this bill being a modest contribution and that you would like to see it narrowed and that you've got some amendments. Could you talk us through what your proposed amendments would be?
Certainly. My colleague referred to the definition that is being used in the amendment, and our recommendation is that it's narrowed further. Ultimately, in simplistic terms, it would exclude plug-in hybrids from benefiting from this exemption. The reason we would recommend that is because ultimately plug-in hybrids still have internal combustion engine vehicles. They are a transition vehicle in our attempt to ultimately decarbonise the transport sector. Australia is behind the pack when it comes to cleaning up its transport. So we, in a sense, have the benefit to learn from what's working overseas. And the clear indication is that, firstly, hybrids are only used a minority of the time as electric vehicles. The study commissioned by the International Council on Clean Transportation looked at the real-world use of over 100,000 hybrids in Europe, North America, and in China, and found that when used privately, so just when it was privately owned, hybrids were only used in the electric mode 1/3 of the time. When they were company cars, they were only used in the electric mode 1/5 of the time. So if ultimately we're driving, excuse the pun, if ultimately we're looking to clean up our transport sector by getting more zero-emission vehicles to be used, and where there are electric options, getting those electric options used more often, then we're not sure hybrid is the best course of action. On top of that, we're seeing that best practice is excluding hybrids from targets around moving away from internal combustion engine vehicles, both excluding it from the range of subsidies available. I know that Germany, for example, is scrapping its plug-in hybrid subsidies this year. We also know that if you look at world leaders like Norway, their target of 100% zero-emission vehicles by 2025, in 3 years' time, does not include hybrids. There's a long list of countries we'd be happy to go through that have basically ruled out hybrids as part of their target for new car sales. We think we should be learning from this and incentivising the best. We deserve the best. We're playing catch-up, so we should be demanding the best and incentivising the best. And that means basically going straight for zero-emission vehicles and therefore narrowing the definition.
Thank you. And so given that, would you actually feel that subsidising hybrids isn't a good use of public money?
Yes, I agree, Senator, that there would be better uses of public money if our ultimate goal is to decarbonise the transport sector.
And in fact, would you actually consider it a fossil fuel subsidy, given as you're saying, the evidence is that hybrids, plug-in electric hybrids, actually use a lot of fossil fuels?
Yeah, what one could conclude, Senator, that there would be a perverse incentive here, that if the car is used as the real-world experience shows from the study that I mentioned, then the majority of time that it would be used as an internal combustion engine vehicle.
Thank you. And look, my final question is that on the home charging infrastructure that we've received submissions noting that it's not included under the FBT exemptions, would you support home charging infrastructure being included as part of the operating costs of owning an electric vehicle?
Senator, we don't have a strong view on that in particular, but if it is incentivising infrastructure that will be used to assist in the electrification of transport and providing that utility at home, we know the majority of charging usually does take place at home, but if these are going to be company cars, then providing these services as well at workplaces and in other locations would be good. I mean, again, we're behind the ball in terms of the infrastructure we require for electric transport as much as the vehicles. And so incentives to bring more of that to Australia would help. The other thing to note is that the Australian Institute regularly polls views on climate change, including on transport, in our Climate of the Nation report. And last year we found that actually one of the highest rating in policies that Australians support, 3/4 of Australians want governments to increase domestic manufacturing of zero-emission vehicles, batteries and components, including the charging infrastructure as well. Having incentives in place to demand more of these things would only provide us with a local market and hopefully local opportunities as well.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for your time this morning. Your submission raises the need for exemption of EVs from luxury car tax. Does that not raise equity issues? And on the same note, what about increasing luxury car taxes on non-EVs?
Senator, you raise a good point. Currently, Australia lacks affordable electric vehicles in the new car sale market. I think there's over 25 in the UK that are under 60 grand Australian, and there's less than 10 in Australia. And so really we're looking at what policies you can put in place to bring as many electric vehicles as possible with a good focus on the affordability end of the spectrum, but then also noting that currently electric vehicles are expensive and we're not going to reach cost parity for another few years, and there are a fair few in the higher end. But those cars will ultimately flow down the system and become second-hand vehicles. Now, I remember my old Holden Calais, which would have been outside my range if I bought first-hand, but given it was 15 years old, was within range when I bought it second-hand. There are benefits flowing on. So we think that there's a suite of policies we can bring forward, including just finding ways to bring all types of electric vehicles to Australia.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that you raised was a potential trade-in rebate for increasing the supply of EVs. How would that work, and what happens to those vehicles that are traded in?
It's a good question. There are numerous examples overseas of how this scheme works. We'd be happy to share details of some of them. They range quite broadly, but in simple terms, you'd receive a certain amount of funding if you did trade in your old internal combustion engine vehicles, which could then be applied towards the purchase of a cleaner vehicle. Mm-hmm. That car would then be scrapped and parts be used and hopefully help with the the other end of the cycle, which is sort of the recycling and circular economy of what we do with these old vehicles as well. But there are great examples of how this works. That's one. Another one is the fee-based scheme that New Zealand has brought in place. At the Electric Vehicle Summit that my colleague mentioned on Friday, the New Zealand Minister for Transport mentioned that they had gone from 3% new car sales electric to 20% in a bit over a year, mainly through targeted policies, one of which was the fee-based scheme, so putting an additional levy on high-polluting vehicles and then using that to incentivize low-polluting vehicles and electric vehicles. And so in a sense, it was a cost-neutral program to tax the things you don't want and incentivize the things you do.
Thank you. And just finally, do you have a view on whether the FBT exemption should be extended to e-bikes, more sort of active transport?
Senator, that's a great recommendation. We would fully support that. We think there should be a variety of mobility options available. We know the popularity just in our town here in the ACT of electric scooters. We would also see great opportunities incentivising electric bikes, and I believe the ACT government locally have just included electric bikes in the next round of their EV strategy and incentives as well. That would be a welcome addition.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. I'll go now to Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Australia Institute. What are some of the impediments in the Australian EV market that might dampen the take-up of this particular FBT initiative?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. I mean, right now there is a shortage of supply. The Electric Vehicle Council, I think, recently shared anecdotal evidence of manufacturers bringing over a shipment of 500 new EVs and selling out within a day, having a back catalogue in the months. So really we can't get the electric vehicles we want, in a sense, because Australia's competing on the global market. We're a car taker as a country now rather than a car maker, so we have to compete on the global market for vehicles. And the lack of a mandatory fuel efficiency standard, which puts us in the minority of countries. 80% of the world have mandatory fuel efficiency standards on light vehicles. We don't here. Basically means that manufacturers are incentivized to send their cleanest cars, particularly electric vehicles, to other markets, whereas they have no incentive to do that here. If anything, they're penalised if they don't send sufficient electric vehicles to other countries. And so it really means that we're at the bottom of the pecking order. And if we want to drive that up, if we want to change those decisions, then we need to bring in mandatory fuel efficiency standards, which is why it was a welcome announcement from Minister Bowen on Friday that the electric vehicle strategy will include a policy on mandatory fuel efficiency standards. Our recommendation would be that that should be a robust fuel efficiency standard in line with Europe, which is best practice, because ultimately if it's weaker than that, we're still going to be lower on the pecking order. And there's no impediment to us bringing over these cleaner vehicles here. But really it's just a matter of sending the right signals and competing on that market to get the vehicles we need. And hopefully we can do that.
A technical clarification, are you talking about Euro 6 there level instead of Euro 5?
No, Senator, I'm talking more around, so they're otherwise known as CO2 emission standards, fuel efficiency standards, so they're more around the grams per, the grams of CO2 per kilometre. I think the Euro values are more around the tailpipe emissions and qualifying the standards there.
If you could provide me with something that will help me understand that and the difference, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you, Senator Smith.
So that's two factors that might dampen this initiative. Are there any others? People often cite the lack of charging infrastructure. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean that is a fair assessment. Australia is still, certainly nowhere near where other OECD countries are in terms of charging infrastructure, public charging infrastructure. But I would caveat that the majority of charging usually takes place at home, and Australia is quite fortunate in that we have a high uptake of home ownership in the sense that the majority of Australians would have the opportunity to charge at home, but that obviously doesn't count for some apartment buildings and those who live in places where it doesn't exist. So there are some impediments there in terms of charging infrastructure. I do believe that the federal government does have a policy of bringing forward more charging infrastructure to the point where we will have this publicly available every 150 kilometres on major arteries. And also, I think there's efforts being made at the state level to try and correct this as well.
And when do you think that ambition will be realised? The charging stations within 150 kilometres of each other?
I'm not sure exactly. I think the details are yet forthcoming.
So just going to your first point where you identified the shortage of supply of EV vehicles, isn't the perverse effect that this initiative could actually force the price up at a time when we're trying to make them affordable because there is a shortage of supply?
I think there are many factors involved in sort of price setting for these vehicles. I mean, already the demand is exceptionally high, and that's mainly being driven by the really high oil price. Unfortunately, Australia basically imports the majority of its petrol and its diesel. 91% of our liquid fuels are imported. That's gotten worse over the last 10 years, not better. We only have 2 refineries in Australia. We have very few resources locally for oil extraction. We don't have any fuel tankers. Commercial fuel tankers with Australian flags on it. So Australia is incredibly vulnerable in terms of liquid fuel security, and we're completely vulnerable to the price as well, unfortunately. I think that's been a major driver here and also overseas, is what we understand as well, in terms of the high demand. I think that this might increase interest, but ultimately the demand and the price is being driven by numerous factors.
So the creation of a second-hand market is something that many people have identified as a positive byproduct, or a key ingredient. On a scale of 1 to 10, this initiative, how effective is it in developing that second-hand market? With 10 out of 10 being extremely effective.
Would this be sort of absent any other policies that are being considered by the current federal government to complement this?
I think we can only deal with the policies that are known to us, yeah.
Certainly.
No, sorry.
Point of order, Chair. Point of order, Chair.
Senator O'Neill, I'm asking the questions. Yeah.
Point of order, Chair. The committee is... The committee has already been referred to the Minister's public statement last Friday, so if Senator Smith wants to pretend it didn't exist, he can ask questions in a vacuum, but that is not effective in terms of interrogating the legislation.
I think we'll deal with those matters that are legislated or known to be legislated. So sorry for Senator O'Neill's interruption. Yep.
No, don't apologise for me, Senator Smith. That's inappropriate.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill.
Thanks, Senator Smith and Senator O'Neill, and I appreciate your assistance with the challenges of remote chairing, and just wanted to suggest if that could be your last question, Senator Smith, we'll finish up with a couple of
I've got 2 final questions actually, which won't take very long, but I am just interested to know how effective this will be in creating that second-hand market, which many submitters have identified as being, a key next step.
Yeah, it will be a helpful addition to the second-hand market, and it will have a serious. It'll be a serious attempt at improving upon that. So we would see this as certainly a substantive addition to the second-hand market.
Have you been able to quantify exactly how many new electric vehicles will be on the roads as a result of this initiative?
No, Senator. There are too many factors that are outside our knowledge to be able to quantify that.
Could you have a look at the Institute of Public Accountants submission? In their submission, they have quantified what they expect to be the total number of new electric vehicles over the 4-year period, and perhaps you might be able to provide to the committee any comment on the accuracy or otherwise of their estimations. That would be much appreciated.
Certainly, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Chair. And after 9 years of being in the no-go zone on this, I think it's fantastic that there is excitement about the possibility of the transformation that should have been happening a long time ago. I'll probably ask a couple of questions on notice, but I'd like to refer you to the submission from the Uniting Care Queensland. If you wouldn't mind having a look at what they've said, I know that you, if I've heard you correctly, have rejected the need for the hybrids. I've got two questions about that. Can you respond to Uniting Care, who indicate that not only by adopting early in 2009 has it made financial sense to them, they have actually materialised profit and gain on the sale into a second-hand market. So there's that. They also talk about fuel security issue, which you mentioned, by having hybrid, being able to operate in the two modes. Can I ask you, in your submission to us, how much research did you do in regional and rural Australia? Because it is a very, very different life for that very productive part of our country.
Thank you, Senator. I haven't read the Uniting Care submission, so I'd be happy to look
That's
at
on
that.
notice, yep.
And take that on notice. In terms of the opportunities that electrification will provide for regional Australia, we've done some research and looked at a few of looked at a number of different inputs in terms of how this will ultimately impact regional Australia. We think that there's opportunity here for regional Australia to electrify as much as urban Australia. If anything, the average commute is longer, the transportation costs are higher, and if you look at the opportunities involved, if you did put in the right infrastructure, then actually the savings could be quite great, as well as the opportunities of actually using locally made fuels through the rooftop or through regional renewable projects. There are numerous opportunities that you can stack on top of each other to ultimately make electrification
so I
positive.
can see elements there of the if and the possibility and could, and we want to move into making that real, but there is a vast difference in living 4 hours away from your regional hospital and 4 minutes or 40 minutes in a city area where there might be charging infrastructure. So this bill has been critiqued in some ways as being inappropriately engaging with the hybrid sector. And you've given evidence that you don't think it should go that way either. But where is the recourse for huge amounts of productive Australia who do not have the infrastructure that will enable them to actually have solely EVs?
So, Senator, sorry, could you just clarify the question that you're asking?
So do you really think it's fair at this point of time, given the nature of infrastructure in regional and rural Australia, to submit to this committee that it should only apply this fringe benefit tax to solely electrical vehicles? Because we need to speak to every person in our nation and move along the journey together. And we cannot ignore the regional rural people in Australia and the physical realities they confront. So why did you submit without that lens being applied?
Senator, the recommendation we made was not to the exclusion of the impact of what would happen to regional Australia. We made it in the sense that we believe that this will be to the benefit of all Australians, ultimately, firstly, as a climate policy, but secondly, our understanding is really the range that electric vehicles now have, the newest range, is sufficient to cover a number of trips that would be taken both by urban Australians and by regional Australians. I believe there's ANU research that's found that 9 in 10 people living in regional Australia will be within range of the nearest service hub, be able to make a trip without having to stop to charge. This is with the latest round of EVs, and this is what ultimately we want to attract to Australia. By setting the right signals, by having the right demand, by putting in place the right standards, we'll be able to bring over the best vehicles, and those vehicles will be to the benefit of regional Australians as much as urban Australians. We believe that hybrids are really a transition, much like, installing landlines when you could go straight to mobile technology. We believe that hybrids have served a purpose, but ultimately, if we're looking at bringing over the best vehicles, then those would be electric.
I really want to agree with you, but I guess the comments that you made about being at the bottom of the pecking order in terms of the delivery of vehicles to us, and given the incredible supply chain disruption that exists, the reality of getting the quality of vehicles that you've just been talking about is really somewhere down the track. There seems to be another argument for enabling Australians to purchase hybrid and to support those fleets that are going to enable that, because there is some gain, even if we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, because let's face it, we've had the brakes on this for 9 years, right? We've got a lot of catching up to do, haven't we? So can you talk to me about being on the bottom of the pecking order? And can I put on notice a question to the FCAI why that has been allowed to happen to Australia? I'll let you answer that question, and then I'll put one more on notice if I can, Chair.
Certainly. So ultimately, if we are at the bottom of the pecking order, how is it that we can demand the electric vehicles we need that will assist all Australians, and should we ultimately include hybrids in that, given it will be difficult to attract the best electric vehicles? Is that correct,
Yes.
Senator?
That's the reality, isn't it?
Well, yes, but in a sense it's being driven by numerous factors, of which the current government is looking to address some of them. Ultimately, at the end of the day, mandatory fuel efficiency standards are the number one thing that manufacturers say are necessary in order to bring the best vehicles here.
And the Minister announced that on Friday.
And the Minister announced that. And so I actually think that if we're looking at bringing the best electric vehicles here, which will benefit both regional and urban Australia, then in a sense the government's already putting a lot of that in train. And so we will look at what other policies, and we have a number of other policies that we believe will assist in electrification of transport that we could bring forward that are popular according to Climate of the Nation. But in a sense, some of those things are already in train right now. So I think that there is opportunity ahead.
And on notice, just if you could give us some of your thoughts on the benefits of a more coordinated national approach to EVs, and what role the National Electric Vehicle Strategy might play in coordinating efforts across government, industry, unions and consumer groups. Is that in the field of your research?
Yes, it is, Senator. We've done a fair bit of work both in the last Electric Vehicle Committee review, which was in 2018, I think, believed to be chaired by Senator Storer at the time. We reviewed many of the policies there. We've continued to review many of the policies and the real-world examples of what worked. The one recommendation that the previous government adopted out of the Storer review in 2019 was that they would bring forward an electric vehicle strategy. Unfortunately, that didn't actually happen. Instead, we had a future fuels strategy, the FFS, which fell short of actually doing anything to incentivise electric vehicles. I think there's a fair bit that could be done with a new policy, and would be excited to contribute to it.
And as you said, we're no longer car makers, car takers. That's a part of the problem, isn't it? Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.